Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Farshad Abbasi about creating the secure pipeline verification standard and the processes that go into pitching a new project to OWASP. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here again with Farshad. Yes, he's going to join us to talk about the news this week. But before we dive into that, one quick announcement. You can now find us on Instagram. Follow us for highlight reels, giveaway announcements, and more at Sec Weekly. Hello, stranger. Good to see you, Farshad. There's some news we want to walk through, and some of it is a bit of a teaser. Actually, I think touches on some pipeline issues. But one of the things I want to jump in first on is IoT. And yes, of course, there's the joke of there's no S in IoT for security. And in this case, there is also caching, but some bugs in that caching. And in this case, the Wise camera users started to see other what are called events or still photos from other people's cameras. Not a good thing, especially since cameras are a lot of privacy. They're installed inside people's homes. And what stood out to me about this were two things. One, I don't recall seeing like caching errors or concerns or how caching can go wrong on many top 10 lists. So this is one of those things that's probably really good to call out. Is like this often happens though. I haven't seen this, and I don't know in your history, Farshad, if you have some anecdotes or if you've come across like other types of, oops, we shouldn't have cached this, or we're starting to roll something out and things went wrong.
I don't know specifically for caching, but in this vein of people seeing other people's images, wasn't there a vulnerability that was discovered on the Roomba, the automated vacuum, home vacuum machines that expose people's pictures to people that shouldn't be able to see them? I don't know if it was exactly related to this particular problem, but that was something in that same vein that happened last year.
It is, and one of those aspects of that, I'm glad you mentioned pictures, because that should absolutely go into that threat model discussions when you're an AppSec team or just member working with your developers, thinking about what data are we collecting and what does the creepiness factor or the ick factor, or how does that change both in the sense of we're dealing with photos of inside people's homes. We should have, we should make sure we have controls and perhaps importantly tests around that as well.
Yeah, I think what happens in the hardware world is these companies are building these devices really quickly and just shipping them out with very little focus on security at all. And that's why we see a lot of these vulnerabilities show up in quote unquote IoT devices. And hopefully that industry will start to mature, but we'll see. I mean, you've got a lot of these devices built in, some countries like China. I'm not sure how much attention they pay to security. More, they just want to ship products fast and cheap. So that is a problem. And that's something that people should be cognizant, and particularly if they have IoT devices in their home networks, you should definitely segment them separately, because who knows what can crawl out of those devices and go into the rest of your network, particularly if you're a software developer, working remotely at home, connecting to your company's environment. If your machine that you're using is on the same network as those IoT devices, they can very well be used to pivot into your corporate environment. So
actually, let's talk about that. So you brought up something really fun that we're going to do here on ASW in March, which is talk about a sort of a March madness of InfoSec myths, mythology, or perhaps even misconceptions. I, for one, probably would be, my risk tolerance perhaps tends to be higher. I wouldn't necessarily think I need to segment my IoT devices from others under the principle that I have good patch discipline for my other devices, meaning that I understand pivoting probably needs compromised credentials, so I have multi-factor credentials. Pivoting probably means like a known vulnerability, CVE they're exploiting. So if I have like FIDO or MFA and patching, would that temper your segmentation, or how do you think about that?
I'm like you, Mike. I try to address the problems at the source. Mm-hmm. So, rather than putting, let's talk about application security for a second, because this is the application security podcast. I get the question about WAF, right? Should I put a WAF in front of my application or actually harden my application? Our stance at the bank was harden the application. That should be the main thing. Like in your case, patch the machine, fix the problem at the root, right? Like putting something in front of it is more of a Band-Aid. It's a good thing to do. And, we all work in security and we all know about the layered defense or defense in depth model, right? In security, you should have multiple controls at different layers. If you can only do one, it should be done at the core. So in your case, the core would be to make sure your machine's patched, then you have 2FA. But that doesn't mean that you should throw out the layered defense model. It's always a good idea to have that secondary layer control, in this case, the segmentation, because it'll reduce the risk. Because who knows, there may be a 0 day, the patch is not out yet, you haven't had a chance to patch, you've been busy, your machine's out of space, hard drive is full, I can't patch right now because the new OS update is 50 gigs, right? That happens. So it's always good to have that second control so that if, the bad thing happens, you at least won't be impacted. Same thing in with software security, right? WAFs are good, but that shouldn't be the only control that you put in. You should first and foremost patch and secure your software at the core. And then as a second defense, put in a WAF in front of it if you can.
Yeah,
so
and
that's my thoughts.
That's great. And one of the things I actually wanted to mention, you talked about like that WAF or the crunchy, the hard exterior, crunchy interior, in our previous interview segment, that castle and moat approach to web security, application security has been dead for a long time because you have that port 80, port 443 drawbridge that just lets everything in anyway, right?
Yeah.
So I do want to jump around because we've got a couple different, some developer and secure design oriented articles that I think would be great to have your takes on. Here's one that was pretty cool from Apple. So Apple in general is pretty quiet, is few and far between when we see security blog posts from them. And we got a blog post about iMessage introducing post-quantum 3 level, which boils down essentially that they're saying they're using quantum safe cryptographic algorithms for key exchange, and they're also rekeying conversations. So rather than just do an initial key exchange when you and I, Farshad, start an iMessage chat, it will also do it throughout in the duration on I don't know the frequency, but every few minutes or a few hours, under the idea that if someone is just collect now, decrypt later, that decrypt later can't be done with a quantum computer because it's using an algorithm that lends itself, like RSA factorization, for example, lends itself to a quantum attack. Whereas others just at a high level, just briefly throw out like a lattice-based approach or a crypto algorithm isn't as susceptible to quantum. So this is kind of neat work. I'm curious, just what you thought of, seeing this.
But I think my thoughts are that if you're using classic cryptography, right, like TLS and things like that, that's going to be obsolete fairly soon. And this is not just my opinion. So I'm one of the organizers of the OWASP Pacific Northwest Conference. Just a little plug for the conference is this year, June 15. But yes, an OWASP event. And, at a speaker dinner, I was talking to a colleague who's close to the U.S. government and the insiders, and he was saying that they're basically they're giving notifications that within the next 3 years, classical encryption is going to go out the window. China's got quantum computing farms that'll be able to reverse and all that stuff. So they're very quickly moving towards quantum computing and quantum cryptography. And I know that in Vancouver, MasterCard bought a local company here called D-Wave, their quantum computing company, because they're recognizing that they need to get on that game. And of course, when you see a really large financial institution like MasterCard making that kind of a move, it really makes you aware that that's what we all got to be cognizant of. And that's the world that we're moving towards is, regular encryption is not going to work in the next few years. And to protect yourself, you really have to look at what Apple is doing in this case. And
one of the things you actually talked about PCI in the interview segment. I actually want to come back to that because one of my questions you did just now say, we've got to move on off of TLS, we got to move on to something. But realistically, I think you would have seen this as well. The progression off of TLS, or just even going from TLS 1.1 to 1.2, took a long time. So, and I don't think everybody, if everybody's threat model out there is China to hand wave a threat is capturing and decrypting our data, I don't think that's universally applicable to every situation, every environment. So I think a question for you is, how do we position this, or how would you position this when talking about like a customer comes and says, we're on TLS, let's say they're on TLS 1.2, and they come to you and say, we need to get to quantum, quick, I can't even speak now, cryptography quickly. Walk me through that claim or that concern.
I think, Mike, you kind of answered your question by talking about threat modeling, right? You threw the word threat modeling in there, and that's exactly what it boils down to. When we do, when a client comes to us and say, hey, I want to test my application, we first start by doing a business impact assessment. And this is the process that banks follow as well. You look at what is at risk, how much impact is it going to have, and who are the threat actors after it, right? Are the threat actors script kiddies? Are they like skilled individuals? Are they criminal organizations, or are they nation states? And not for nation states are not after everyone's product, right? Nation states are only after certain types of products that have certain type of data with a certain type of impact. So that's how we usually start that conversation, and that's how that's how people should treat this particular situation. Like, what is that risk for me? What kind of assets and how much would they impact me? And who's interested in it? If the answer turns out to be that, yeah, a nation state is after it, then in that case, it warrants the company to look into quantum cryptography. But if your only concern are skilled hackers or script kiddies, in that case, you may not need to do that. So that risk-based approach, doing that threat modeling, looking at the business impact assessment is really, really important in this case.
And I think another part too is just from a developer's perspective, when you look at, call it secure by default, secure designs, I would hope that, roll out TLS 1.3, these types of things are useful. Have you had trouble like encouraging updates just because security, using that reason as justification versus there's a performance or there's something else just to grab that attention? How have you done that successfully?
When I got my first security job, I was taught really early in the game not to tell people to do things because security. If you do that, you're going to be that kind of security person that the developers will run from. You want to be the security guy or the girl that developers come to you. And to do that, you have to take a balanced approach. You can't just hit people in the head saying, it says you have to do TLS 1.3, therefore do it. What is the realistic? Is it realistic for that particular threat scenario to happen that warrants you to go to TLS 1.3? Because the attacks that can be done against TLS 1.3 may be fairly theoretical or hypothetical and not happen to everybody. So again, it goes back into take a balanced approach, do the threat model, determine what the actual risk is, and then take that apply the controls that are appropriate for that risk level. And that basically was the approach that I took to make friends with the development team. So within the first year of taking my first AppSec job, the relationship went from everybody running away from you to actually coming to you, right? So that's, when I first took that job, my boss walked me around the building and then he said, look, as we walk around, they're all going to look away. All the developers look away because they think we're cops. And so Farshad, your job is to change that relationship. So within a year, I changed that relationship to the point that the developers were coming to me when they had a new project and asking for help, not running away. So that's the sort of approach that people need to take in these cases to be able to convince people to implement the right controls that you're recommending.
Actually, one of the things I neglected to highlight from, again, our interview segment, which I thank you again, it was really fun, obviously, since I keep calling back to it, is you'd mentioned, bringing more developers to the OWASP meetups. That was one of the things that you were highlighting doing. I think you've also gone and done some outreach and speaking at, lo and behold, developer conferences as well, meaning rather than get developers come to like OWASP conferences or security conferences, you've done the inverse. I guess maybe tell us real quick about that, or why did you take that approach?
Yeah, really good point, Mike, because I speak at a lot of conferences, but primarily we're security conferences. And of course, I run the OWASP Vancouver meetup and I help with the OWASP Pacific Northwest conference. And what I started to realize, I'm like, it's more security people coming to these things because they're called security conferences. And developers, I was like, I'm a developer. Why would I go to a security conference? It's not related to my field, right? It's not in their first nature to think, well, I'm building something, I should secure it. But so they don't really do that. So as a result, I made it my mission to say, hey, you know what? I need to go where the developers are. Where are they developers? They're going to Developer Week. They're going to DevOps days. They're going to developer meetups. So let's go to those places where they're hanging out and then bring the security message. I'm seeing more and more of that. Last year at Developer Week, there were a few security talks. But this year, there was a dedicated track for security, which was really nice to see. And I'm hoping to see more and more of that, is that security folks started to go to these developer communities and events and start to bring that message there and encourage more of them to get involved. And also on the OWASP side, we're doing outreach, going to companies and saying, hey, if you have developers, please send them to these meetups. They're free. There's basically free training. There's free resources. And a lot of companies aren't even aware of what's available to them, which is really important.
That's a great message. So, and what we'll do is we'll bug you after this to get some links, maybe to one of your presentations, just to give an example of this is talking to developers. I know you've got to run real quick and do more AppSec things, but before you do, I want to hit one more article that touches actually on very closely to the SPVS, the secure pipeline verification standard that you were telling us about. And this is some work from Hidden Layer called Silent Sabotage. And what was interesting is they went and identified basically an attack technique where they were able to demonstrate creating a malicious pull request by mucking about with some code execution through some pickling done with PyTorch. And what this mucking about did, which is my technical go-to term, would basically modify the model that is being hosted here and could subtly change the model's behavior. And one of the things they pointed out was that they could not only get persistence within the containers that Hugging Face was running, they could also create a PR that modifies the model. But this PR, unfortunately, isn't very human friendly. It's basically binary code. And how can a human brain understand this was a change in a model so that cats are more correctly identified as cats rather than dogs? Or this is something that is able to bypass facial recognition for someone that is wearing sunglasses and a forward security t-shirt, like Farshad is doing. So I'm curious, how does this start to make you think about secure pipeline, or this is kind of an interesting take on pull requests?
I'm reading the article here, Mike. It says they said they achieved this using nothing but a hijacked model that the bot was designed to convert, allowing an attacker to request changes to any repository on platform by impersonating the Hugging Face conversion bot, right? So this brings about some of the controls that couple of them that I talked about, flow control, right? Hey, do you have a pull request review, a code review for your, as a gate? Do you have certain scanners? I mean, scanners may not help because if these scanners today are rules-based, so if you put something in, it may not pick it up. But definitely having that gate as a manual code review, if this thing is trying to modify that repository, it wouldn't get committed before it gets merged to your master. Someone would review it and would determine that, hey, an attack was happening. But also there are a few other controls like limiting the permissions that a particular user ID would have on that code base. Having access-based controls and having those kinds of gates would reduce that impact. So, for example, if this model could submit something, which repos could it access? Should it access all the repos, right? Because here they're saying they could request changes to any repository on their platform. So limiting what credentials can do what on what repo, and then of course having some flow control mechanisms like a code review or other types of reviews, potentially even automated ones that can highlight that if something was being checked in that may be malicious.
Yeah, and I think too, part of this write-up also talks about the persistence. The containers weren't as ephemeral as they could have been, or there wasn't the sandboxing. So I think that does highlight a couple controls that will come out of your standard.
Immutable, yeah, and you just hit on something as well. If companies are implementing things as containers, they should try to follow that immutable and ephemeral model, right? In the container world, you shouldn't persist any data. Those containers should be blown up every time you do a CD, and just new ones should be deployed. All your persistence should be happening somewhere else so that you can refresh that. Having that ephemeral and immutable model is really good because now developers can't go and install something that machine that's malicious and it'll linger for a long time, right? The old model was you had a VM and then you just ran your code in there and that VM sat there forever and you just updated it, you patched it and did all that, right? So why do it like that? Why not just use containers that are immutable and ephemeral, and then every time you do a CD or you do a deployment, you just put out a new container, and then if the attacker had gone into your container, then that container would be blown up. I think Netflix does that almost once a week or even more frequently. Our goal at HSBC was to get where Netflix was, to be able to just deploy containers on a regular basis, and that eliminates a lot of your security challenges.
Well, I know today you've been very gracious with your time because you have a goal to get out very quickly and go off and do some more real world AppSec work. So I'll wrap up a little bit later after this. But Farshad, I do want to take the moment to say thank you very much for walking us not only through the interview segment, but joining us for the news as well. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Always a great chat, Mike.
Awesome. We'll see you later, and we'll bring you back as you work on more of the SPVS. So thanks once again, Farshad.
Sounds great. Have a nice day.
Cheers. And listeners, do stick around because we have maybe one or two more articles that I'm going to run through very quickly, but run through solo. One of them is some fun work from some university researchers about PrintListener. And this one I just want to walk through real quick because what they did was identify the sound of fingerprints across a smartphone, for example. And they demonstrated this not under ideal acoustic conditions, but they did this where users would rub their finger across the surface of a smartphone and over a Skype, a Zoom, etc., or even a YouTube, like you're listening to now, perhaps, they could isolate the sound of the fingerprint and the ridges of that fingerprint, may around the 4 kilohertz range, just get slightly technical, generate a unique signature that could about 10% of the time lead to a complete reconstruction of that fingerprint. So this is really neat research that actually looks like real world scenarios. And rather than just a kind of lab theoretical. Now, I will say, as Farshad was very helpful reminding us that this was a threat model that is not necessarily completely universal, and it's not the biggest threat that everybody needs to stop swiping all of their phones while they're on uh, Zoom meetings, etc. But some fun research. And finally, for those of you wondering about secure designs, highlighted an article from Kelly Shortridge and her partner in crime in this article, Richard, I think, talking about a response to CISA's call for secure by design. And if you skip down to section 1.2.1, you'll get a long list of items that could be done that are actionable from a secure software perspective. And this is talking about things like updates, using commodity software in the sense of the classic case of don't roll your own crypto, but just use a TLS 1 stack or sorry, a TLS 3.0 stack that is already out there, whether it's Boring SSL, OpenSSL, etc. So it's a really good walkthrough. One of the things I liked and appreciated about this was it did talk about automated build processes, the security, privacy properties of the integration testing. So things that I think are going to be very relevant to Farshad and team's work. And there was also some discussion of memory safety and how to use that. So a couple things I wanted to highlight before I'm all alone here saying goodbye to all of you listeners. So with that, we will wrap up. Stay tuned, however, for March. We are going to have a bit of March madness and things about InfoSec myths and misconceptions. And we'll see if we can break down what is the most mythological or misunderstood or misdirection of security advice out there that we want to get rid of. So thank you once again for joining us. Thank you, Farshad. Please do subscribe, everyone. Share on the socials. Check out the show notes. And speaking of all things AppSec and some things not so AppSec, check out Firebird from LA Arson. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.